If you leave this family, don't expect us to be here when you come back," my daughter-in-law Emily said across the dinner table, her voice calm, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet room. And for a moment the only sound in the house was the faint ticking of the wall clock above the kitchen doorway. The same clock my husband Thomas had hung there more than 30 years ago when this house was still new and our son Daniel was just a boy who needed a stool to reach the sink. I looked at Emily, then at Daniel sitting beside her, and neither of them realized that by the time those words left her mouth, the decision they feared had already been made, and the future they assumed was guaranteed had quietly slipped out of their hands. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life I believe that family meant responsibility, patience, and sacrifice. The kind that doesn't get written down or thanked out loud, but simply becomes part of the rhythm of everyday life. The dinners cooked, the holidays planned, the small problems solved before anyone else even noticed them. And for 40 years I lived inside that rhythm without questioning it. This house stood on half an acre of land outside a small town in Ohio. A white two-story place with creaky wooden floors and a wide porch that faced a row of old maple trees. The kind of house people say is full of memories. But what they don't tell you is that memories can quietly turn into expectations, and expectations can quietly turn into obligations. After Thomas passed away 3 years ago, the house became quieter, not just because he wasn't there anymore, but because the center of everything shifted. Daniel and Emily started visiting more often at first, bringing groceries, offering to help with repairs, talking about family and support, and how important it was for us to stay close now that life had changed. And I believe them because that's what mothers do. We believe our children when they tell us they care. But little by little the visits turned into conversations about practical things, about how big the house was for one person, about how expensive property taxes had become, about how wonderful it would be if the whole family could stay together under one roof again once Daniel and Emily started planning for children. And every conversation ended the same way, with Emily smiling politely and saying something that sounded thoughtful but always seemed to circle back to the same point, that the future would be easier if I simply stayed where I was and let the family grow around me. At first I thought it was kindness, then practicality. But over time I began to notice small details that didn't fit the picture they were painting. The way Emily talked about the house as if it already belonged to the next generation. The way Daniel referred to the spare bedroom as the nursery even though no baby had arrived yet. The way conversations about my plans for travel or moving somewhere warmer were gently dismissed with phrases like, "You wouldn't want to start over at this age, Mom." And I started to realize that the life they imagined for me had already been decided without my input. The truth is that people rarely announce their expectations directly. They build them slowly, piece by piece, until one day you wake up and discover the future everyone else planned for you feels smaller than the life you once imagined for yourself. The moment everything became clear didn't happen at the dinner table. It happened 2 days earlier on a quiet Tuesday morning when sunlight was coming through the kitchen window and I was standing at the sink rinsing my coffee mug, while Daniel and Emily talked in low voices near the hallway. Assuming I couldn't hear them, and Emily said something that stopped me cold, something so simple and casual that it might have sounded harmless to anyone else. But to me it felt like the final puzzle piece falling into place, because she said, "As long as Margaret stays here, childcare will never be a problem." And Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't laugh or say she was joking. He simply said, "Yeah, Mom loves helping." And that was the moment I understood that the life they expected from me had already been decided, measured, and quietly scheduled around their future. And in that quiet kitchen, with the maple trees swaying outside and the old clock ticking steadily on the wall, I made the decision that would eventually lead to the words Emily spoke at the dinner table tonight. Because for the first time in 40 years, I asked myself a question I had never asked before. What if the rest of my life didn't belong to anyone but me? I did not answer Emily right away when she said those words across the dinner table, because silence can reveal more than anger ever could. And in that moment, I simply folded my hands on the table and watched the two of them carefully, the way someone watches a scene they have already seen before and are finally beginning to understand. Daniel shifted in his chair first, the way he used to when he was younger and had done something he knew I would not approve of. And he cleared his throat as if he was preparing to smooth over the tension. But Emily did not look uncomfortable at all. She leaned back slightly and crossed her arms with the quiet confidence of someone who believes the outcome is already decided. The dining room looked exactly the same as it had for decades. The long oak table polished so many times the surface reflected the warm light from the ceiling lamp. The china cabinet standing against the wall filled with plates that had been used for birthdays and Christmas, dinners, and countless Sunday meals. But that night the room felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the truth had quietly stepped into the space between us and refused to leave. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing dinner, the same way I had done thousands of times before, roasting chicken in the oven, slicing fresh bread, setting the table with the good plates because Daniel always said dinner tasted better when it looked special, and while I worked in the kitchen I kept thinking about that moment 2 mornings earlier when I had overheard their conversation in the hallway. The casual way Emily had spoken about childcare, as if my future had already been assigned a permanent role in their plans. I remember standing at the sink that morning holding my coffee mug while the sunlight came through the window and lit up the kitchen floor. And I remember how strangely calm I felt when the realization settled in my chest. Because for the first time the confusion I had been feeling for years suddenly made sense. All those small comments about how lucky I was to live close to family. All those gentle reminders that moving away would be lonely at my age. All those suggestions that the spare bedroom should stay ready for a grandchild someday. They had not been conversations at all. They had been quiet steps in a plan that everyone seemed to understand except me. Mothers spend so many years trying to make life easier for their children that sometimes we forget to ask whether the life we are living is still our own. And as I stood there in that quiet kitchen, I realized that I had slowly become part of a future that did not include my dreams, only my usefulness. So 2 hours after that conversation ended, I drove into town, something I had not done alone in months because Daniel usually insisted on helping with errands, and I parked outside a small real estate office on Main Street where a sign in the window read Whitaker Realty in gold letters that were beginning to fade in the sun. Inside the office, a woman named Linda greeted me with a polite smile and asked how she could help. And when I told her that I wanted to know what my house might be worth if I decided to sell it, the words sounded strange even to my own ears, like the first sentence of a story I had never imagined telling. Linda asked a few questions about the property, about the size of the lot and the age of the roof, and whether the kitchen had been renovated recently. And as we spoke, I felt something I had not felt in years, a quiet sense of possibility that did not belong to anyone else's expectations. When I left the office that afternoon, the air outside felt cooler and clearer somehow. And for the first time since Thomas passed away, I drove past the town park instead of turning straight toward home, watching families walk their dogs and children ride bicycles along the path. And I realized that life had not stopped moving forward simply because I had been standing still. By the time dinner began tonight, I already knew the path I was going to take, and that is why. When Emily warned me that I should not expect them to be here if I left, I did not feel hurt or frightened or uncertain, because the truth is that the life they believed I could not live without them was already beginning to unfold, one quiet decision at a time. I looked at Daniel after Emily finished speaking, and for a moment I saw the same boy who used to run across the backyard chasing fireflies on warm summer nights. The same boy who once believed that his mother could fix anything simply by being there. But the man sitting in front of me now looked at the table instead of at me, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood, as if he was waiting for me to change my mind the way I always had before. The truth about family expectations is that they do not appear overnight. They grow quietly over time, shaped by habits and assumptions until they begin to feel permanent. And for years I had accepted those assumptions without realizing how small they were making my world. After Thomas passed away, the first year felt like walking through fog. Every room in the house carried echoes of our life together: his reading chair by the window, the old toolbox in the garage, the garden he planted behind the fence where tomatoes and basil still grew every summer. And during that year, Daniel and Emily visited often, bringing groceries and offering help with repairs and insisting that I should not have to face everything alone. I appreciated their kindness, and I believed that what they wanted was simply to stay close as a family. But slowly those visits began to include conversations about the future, conversations that always sounded thoughtful but always pointed in the same direction. Emily would say things like it was wonderful that the house had so many bedrooms because it meant the whole family could grow together, and Daniel would mention how helpful it would be when they had children to have someone experienced nearby who could watch them while they worked. And every time those conversations happened, I smiled politely, because I assumed they were just imagining possibilities, the way people sometimes talk about dreams without expecting them to happen immediately. But over time, those possibilities began to sound less like dreams and more like plans. The spare bedroom became the nursery in their conversations, even though nothing had changed in the house itself, and Emily began suggesting small adjustments around the property as if she were already organizing a future that included permanent roles for everyone. One afternoon last autumn, she even brought a catalog of furniture and showed me a rocking chair she thought would look perfect near the front window once there was a baby in the house. And when I asked where that chair would go, she smiled and said that it would probably replace my reading table because that corner would be better for watching a child play in the yard. She said it lightly as if it were a harmless suggestion, but something about the casual certainty in her voice stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Looking back now, I can see that the signs were everywhere, small details that seemed insignificant at the time, but together formed a picture I had been too busy to notice. The way Emily referred to the house as the place where their children would grow up. The way Daniel started talking about expanding the garage someday to make room for a second car. The way both of them reacted with gentle concern whenever I mentioned traveling or visiting my sister in Arizona for a few months. Each time they would say that the house might feel empty without me, or that moving away at my age could be difficult. And because those words sounded caring, I never questioned them. But standing in the dining room that night, while the clock ticked quietly above the doorway, I realized that the life they had been imagining did not include the possibility that I might want something different, something that did not revolve around being available whenever their plans required it. I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip before setting it back on the table. Then I looked directly at Daniel and Emily and noticed something I had not fully understood until that moment. They were not waiting to hear what I truly wanted. They were waiting for me to reassure them that everything would continue exactly the way they expected. And that realization made the room feel strangely calm instead of tense. Because once you finally understand the shape of the expectations surrounding you, it becomes much easier to decide whether you are willing to keep living inside them. I kept looking at Daniel and Emily across the table, but my thoughts drifted far beyond that dining room and into memories that stretched back decades, to a time when this house was nothing more than a patch of uneven land and a dream Thomas and I were brave enough to believe in. We bought the property when Daniel was 5 years old, back when the road outside was still gravel and the nearest grocery store was 10 miles away. And I still remember the day Thomas stood in the empty field holding a folded blueprint while the wind pushed his hair across his forehead, and he said that one day our son would grow up in a place built with our own hands. Those early years were not easy. Thomas worked long shifts at the machine shop, and I took part-time jobs at the library and later at the elementary school cafeteria just to keep our finances steady. But every evening we returned to this land and slowly turned it into a home, painting walls, planting trees, fixing fences, celebrating every small milestone as if it were proof that our hard work meant something. Daniel grew up running through the same yard that now stretched quietly outside the dining room window, climbing the maple tree Thomas planted when he was 7, learning to ride a bicycle on the cracked driveway where the concrete had been poured by Thomas and 2 neighbors on a hot August afternoon. Through all those years, Thomas repeated the same lesson again and again, sometimes in small comments during dinner, and sometimes in longer conversations late at night after Daniel had gone to bed. He believed that family should support each other, but never trap each other. And one evening not long before his health began to fail, he said something that stayed with me long after the doctors began using serious words like treatment and recovery plans. We were sitting on the porch watching the sunset fade behind the trees when Thomas turned to me and said, "Margaret, promise me something. Promise me that when the time comes you will keep living your life and not shrink it for anyone else." And I remember laughing softly because at that moment the idea felt impossible. Our life together had always been built around the needs of our family, the routines that kept everyone connected and safe. But Thomas shook his head gently and said that there was a difference between loving your family and disappearing inside their expectations. And that sometimes people who mean well forget that the person who held everything together also deserves a future of her own. After he passed away, those words returned to me many times, especially during the quiet evenings when the house felt larger than it ever had before, but I pushed them aside because I believed the best way to honor his memory was to stay close to the people we had spent so many years raising and supporting. Yet as the months turned into years, I began noticing how easily my own plans disappeared whenever Daniel and Emily talked about theirs. How the idea of visiting friends or traveling somewhere new always seemed less practical than staying nearby in case they needed help. And how often the future they described assumed that I would always be right here in this house waiting for the next request. Sitting at the table that night, I realized that Thomas had understood something long before I did. He had known that love should not quietly become a set of expectations that leaves one person carrying the weight of everyone else's plans. And as I remembered the sound of his voice on that old porch swing, I felt a calm certainty settle into my chest. The same calm certainty that had guided me into the real estate office 2 days earlier. Because sometimes the most important promise you can keep is the one you made to the person who believed in your future, even when you had forgotten to imagine it for yourself. The quiet in the dining room lasted longer than anyone expected after my last sip of water, and I could see Daniel watching me carefully now. The way people do when they sense a conversation is about to change direction, but they are not sure how. Outside the window, the evening light had begun to fade, and the maple trees in the yard moved gently in the breeze. And for a moment, I thought about how many dinners had taken place at this same table, how many times we had sat together talking about school and work and plans for the future, never imagining that one day the same room would hold a very different kind of conversation. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. And when I finally spoke, my voice sounded calm even to my own ears. I told them that earlier that week I had taken a drive into town and visited a real estate office. And as soon as those words left my mouth, I saw Emily straighten in her chair, while Daniel looked at me with a puzzled expression as if he were trying to understand whether I was joking or serious. I explained that I had asked about the value of the house and what the process would look like if someone in my situation decided to sell. And Daniel blinked several times before leaning forward slightly and asking why I would even consider something like that when everything here was already settled. The word settled hung in the air for a moment because it revealed more than he probably intended. It suggested that the future of this house had already been decided somewhere in his mind long before I had been invited into the conversation. Emily was the first to recover from the surprise, and she asked a series of practical questions about the meeting. Whether the realtor had mentioned a price range or how long houses in this neighborhood usually stayed on the market. But there was something too quick about her curiosity, something that sounded less like concern and more like calculation. I answered her politely, but without adding any extra details. And then I told them that during my drive home from that meeting, I had realized something simple but important, something that had not been clear to me before that moment. For years after Thomas passed away, I believed that the best way to keep our family strong was to remain exactly where everyone expected me to be, living in the same house, following the same routines, making sure that Daniel and Emily always had a place they could count on whenever they needed help. But as the road stretched in front of my car that afternoon, I began to see how easily a person can mistake stability for obligation. I told them that the idea of selling the house was not about abandoning our family history or forgetting the life Thomas and I had built together. It was about recognizing that the years ahead of me still belonged to my own choices, not only to the plans other people might have imagined. Daniel shook his head slowly as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing, and he said that moving away would make everything more complicated for them once they started a family, as though the natural direction of my life should adjust automatically to the future he had already begun planning. Emily watched me closely while he spoke, her expression thoughtful but tense, and I could see that both of them were waiting for the same reassurance they had always received before. The familiar moment when I would soften my words and promise that nothing needed to change after all. But the quiet certainty that had begun 2 days earlier in my kitchen remained steady inside me. And as I looked at the two of them sitting across the table, I realized that the most surprising part of this conversation was not my decision to explore a different future. It was the simple fact that until now neither of them had ever considered the possibility that I might want one. Daniel leaned back in his chair and ran his hand slowly across his forehead, as if he needed a moment to process what I had just said. and the quiet that followed was not the comfortable silence of a family dinner, but the kind that forms when expectations begin to shift in ways no one prepared for. Emily was the first to speak again, and her voice carried a careful tone that sounded calm on the surface, but carried a tension beneath it. The kind people use when they are trying to guide a conversation back toward the outcome they prefer. And she asked whether I had thought about how difficult it would be to start somewhere new at my age, whether I had considered how lonely it might feel to leave the neighborhood where I had spent most of my adult life. I listened to her questions without interrupting because they sounded familiar. They were the same concerns she had mentioned many times before whenever the subject of travel or change appeared, and yet something about them felt different tonight, because now I understood that those concerns were not really about protecting me from loneliness, but about protecting the structure of a future they had already built around my presence. Daniel nodded while she spoke, and then added that the house had always been the center of our family, the place where holidays happened, and where grandchildren would someday learn to walk across the living room floor. And as he described that picture of the future, I realized that every detail of it assumed I would remain exactly where I was, quietly holding the same position year after year, while life unfolded around me. I let him finish before answering, because sometimes people need to hear their own expectations out loud before they can recognize them. And when the room finally fell silent again, I explained that my decision was not something I had made impulsively. It was the result of many quiet moments over the past few years when I had begun to notice how easily my own plans disappeared whenever someone else described theirs. I told them about the drive through town earlier that week, about the way the streets looked different when I was not rushing home to finish chores or prepare dinner, about the small real estate office where the woman behind the desk had spoken to me not as someone who was needed by everyone else, but simply as a person considering a new chapter in her life. Emily glanced toward Daniel quickly when I mentioned the real estate office, and I could see the calculation returning to her expression as she asked whether I had already signed anything or made any official arrangements. And the way she asked the question made it clear that the house itself had suddenly become the center of her attention. I answered honestly that I had not signed anything yet, that I had only asked questions and gathered information. But I also said that the conversation had reminded me of something Thomas used to say about the importance of choosing the direction of your life before someone else chooses it for you. Daniel looked down at the table again when I mentioned his father, and the muscles in his jaw tightened slightly, as if he were wrestling with the idea that the future he had imagined might not unfold the way he expected. The truth is, that change often begins quietly long before anyone else notices it. And while they were still thinking about what my decision might mean for their plans, I had already begun thinking about what it might mean for my freedom. And as I sat there listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, I realized that the conversation was no longer about whether I would remain in the role they had imagined for me. It was about whether they could accept the possibility that the rest of my life might finally belong to my own choices. Daniel pushed his chair back slightly and let out a slow breath as if the conversation had become heavier than he expected, and for the first time that evening he looked directly at me instead of at the table or the window behind my chair. The look on his face was not anger yet, but it carried a mixture of confusion and disbelief that reminded me of the expression he used to wear as a teenager whenever something in his life suddenly stopped following the plan he had imagined. He asked me quietly whether I was truly serious about selling the house, or whether this was simply something I was considering because the last few years had been difficult after losing Thomas, and the way he said my husband's name made the room feel even quieter. Emily remained still beside him, but I noticed the way her fingers rested tightly around the stem of her glass. And although she had not interrupted Daniel this time, I could sense that she was measuring every word I said, as if each answer might determine what would happen to the future she had already begun arranging in her mind. I told them that grief had certainly changed many things in my life, but it had not taken away my ability to think clearly, and that the decision to explore something different had grown slowly over time, long before the meeting at the real estate office or the conversation we were having tonight. I explained that during the past year I had begun noticing how easily people can assume a role will remain unchanged simply because it has existed for a long time, and how often that assumption becomes so comfortable that no one stops to ask the person living inside that role whether they still want it. Daniel leaned forward again and said that no one was forcing me to do anything, that the house had always been mine, and that they had only talked about the future because they believed we all wanted the same thing, but there was a tension behind his words now that had not been there earlier. Emily finally spoke again, and her voice was softer this time, but carried a careful precision as she asked whether I had thought about what would happen to the house if I did sell it, whether I realized how much it meant to Daniel to keep the place where he grew up. I listened to her question and then glanced around the dining room, letting my eyes rest for a moment on the china cabinet and the photographs on the wall, the small snapshots of birthdays and summer barbecues and school graduations that had been placed there over the years. Those pictures represented decades of our family's life together, and I felt the weight of those memories as clearly as I felt the quiet determination that had been growing inside me. I told them that of course I understood what the house meant to Daniel, because I had been there for every moment of the life that had unfolded inside it. But I also explained that a house is not the same thing as a future and that memories do not disappear simply because the walls around them change. Daniel looked frustrated now, and he said that selling the property would complicate things for them in ways I might not fully understand. And although he did not say it directly, the meaning behind his words was clear. The future they had imagined depended on the assumption that I would remain here exactly as I had always been. I noticed Emily glance at him briefly as if encouraging him to continue, but instead he fell silent again, and the ticking clock filled the room once more. As I watched them sitting across the table, I realized that what they were really struggling with was not the idea of me moving somewhere else. It was the realization that the life they had quietly designed around my presence might no longer exist. And in that moment, I understood that the conversation had reached the point where expectations and reality could no longer share the same room without finally confronting each other. Emily set her glass down carefully on the table as if she needed both hands free to steady her thoughts. And for a moment, she did not look at me or at Daniel, but at the surface of the table itself, tracing a faint line in the wood with her fingertip before finally speaking again. When she did, her voice carried a tone that sounded calm but strained, the way people sound when they are trying to maintain control over a situation that has begun to slip in a direction they did not expect. She said that she understood my desire to make my own choices, but that decisions like selling the house could affect more than just my personal plans. And she reminded me that Daniel had always believed he would one day raise his children in the same place where he had grown up. Daniel nodded slowly as she spoke, and added that keeping the house in the family had always felt like a way of honoring the years Thomas and I had spent building it, as though preserving the walls themselves would somehow protect the memories inside them. I listened to both of them carefully because I could hear the emotion behind their words, but I could also hear the assumption beneath those emotions, the belief that honoring the past required my future to remain exactly where it had always been. I looked toward the hallway for a moment where an old photograph hung on the wall showing Daniel at 7 years old, holding a fishing rod nearly as tall as he was while Thomas stood behind him smiling proudly. And the memory of that summer afternoon by the lake came back so clearly that for a second I could almost hear Thomas laughing again. Then I turned back to the table and told them something that I had not said out loud until that moment, something I had only realized gradually during the quiet weeks after my visit to the real estate office. I told them that loving a home and being bound to it are two very different things, and that the memories we share are not contained inside the walls of this house, but inside the lives we have lived together. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly as if she were trying to decide whether my words were simply sentimental or whether they meant that the house truly might be leaving the future she had imagined for it. Daniel leaned forward again and asked whether I had already made a final decision, whether the meeting in town meant that the property would soon be placed on the market. I answered him honestly that I had not signed any paperwork yet, but that I had taken the first steps necessary to understand what the process would look like, and that learning those details had made one thing clearer than it had ever been before: the idea that my life did not have to remain exactly as it had been simply because that was what everyone else had come to expect. The quiet in the room deepened after I said that, and the ticking clock above the doorway sounded louder than it had earlier in the evening, as if time itself had decided to remind us that moments like this rarely last forever. Emily finally leaned back in her chair and folded her arms across her chest, while Daniel stared at the table again with a troubled expression that mixed frustration with uncertainty. I could see that both of them were trying to reconcile two different versions of the future, the one they had quietly planned, and the one that was beginning to unfold in front of them now. And as I watched them sitting there in the fading light of the dining room, I understood something that had not been fully clear to me until that moment. That the real reason this conversation felt so difficult was not because I was walking away from my family, but because they were discovering for the first time that the life they had arranged around my presence might not belong to them to decide. The room remained quiet after my last words, and the silence carried a weight that none of us had expected when dinner began earlier that evening. The kind of silence that appears when people realize the conversation has reached a point where the future can no longer follow the same path it once seemed to promise. Daniel stared down at the table for several long seconds, and I could almost see the memories moving through his mind. The same childhood moments that had crossed mine earlier. Afternoons in the backyard, birthday parties in the living room, school mornings when Thomas drove him to class in the old pickup truck that used to sit in our driveway. Emily finally broke the silence, but this time her voice did not carry the careful control it had earlier in the evening. Instead, it sounded tired and uncertain, as if she had just realized that the outcome she had quietly assumed for years might not be within her reach after all. She asked whether I truly believed leaving the house would make me happier, whether I had considered how different life might feel somewhere else after spending so many decades in the same place. I thought about her question for a moment before answering, because the truth was not something that could be explained in a single sentence. Happiness does not arrive simply because someone changes their address or moves to a new town. But there is a difference between staying somewhere out of love and staying somewhere because everyone else expects you to remain there. I told them that the house would always be part of our story, that every room inside it held the history of our family. But that history did not belong only to the walls or the land beneath them. It belonged to the people who had lived those years together. Daniel finally looked up again, and this time there was something softer in his expression. Not agreement exactly, but the beginning of understanding that the conversation was not really about the property itself. He said quietly that he had always assumed the house would remain the center of our family, because it had always felt that way when he was growing up. And I told him that I understood that feeling better than anyone, because I had been there for every step of that life. Every summer barbecue, every holiday morning, when the living room floor filled with wrapping paper and laughter. But I also explained that the years ahead of me were still part of my life as well, and that honoring the past did not mean giving up the chance to experience something new while time was still offering that opportunity. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm while we sat there together, and the evening light slowly faded from the windows. And for the first time since the conversation began, no one rushed to fill the silence with arguments or explanations. Emily eventually stood up and began gathering the plates from the table, while Daniel remained seated for a moment longer watching the quiet room around him. And as I rose from my chair, I realized that the tension that had filled the house earlier had begun to ease slightly, replaced by something quieter and more complicated, but also more honest. When I stepped onto the porch later that night, the air felt cool and calm, and the maple trees moved gently in the darkness the same way they had for decades. And as I looked out across the yard, I understood that the decision I had begun making days earlier had not taken anything away from my family. It had simply reminded all of us that the life ahead of me was still mine to walk, one choice at a time.